you about was, um, within Buddhism, obviously, the concept of anatta, non-self or no self, whatever translation you prefer. Which one do you think is more accurate? Maybe let's start from that.
Um, the actual correct or adequate translation is not the issue.
Hmm. So it's sort of pointing to the
I
same.
Yeah, they're trying to all understand the same thing, and so they keep pointing off in all directions.
Right, right.
Okay. The Western mentality doesn't understand what the Buddha was talking about in the sense of anatta
Hmm.
versus, let us say, reincarnation. Do you have any particular questions about it, or shall I just launch right in?
Yeah, the question, I suppose, was sort of, if we obviously within Buddhism, there's this refutation of an enduring soul concept that we see in a lot of other, philosophical and religious traditions. The question there is if there's sort of not what we might call an agent that is performing, the actions or whatever. There's not a center that is dictating everything. Who or what is actually inclining toward nibbana? Who is
All
making
right.
these
Well,
choices?
we can talk about that. You use the word agent, and that actually is a useful word to use for understanding
Hmm.
agency. Okay. In United States federal law, in certain circumstances, the definitions are used of the term ownership, control, and agency.
Hmm.
Okay. And without going into a lot of legalese, an owner is not always the problem. The example was uh, in very quickly. In the Carter administration, a law was passed to make mines reclaim the land if they had done any kind of strip mining or any mountaintop or anything that wasn't a deep hole mine
Hmm.
that disturbed the surface. Then the miners had to go back and reclaim that land before they could get another miner's permit.
Hmm.
Okay, the question is who owned that strip mine? Who was the agents and who controlled it?
Right.
Because you could have a whole group of five guys, all of them are involved in that strip mine, and they all decided to get together and say, let's go get another permit from the United States government, only this time it's not Billy, it's going to be Joe who gets the permit, right?
Hmm.
We
Hmm.
also wind up with Aunt Susie kinds of situations in the sense that the owners of the old mine will now sell it for $1 to their sister, and now she owns it, and now she's got to clean it up. And meanwhile, the original owner doesn't own the land anymore, therefore he's not responsible for cleaning it up, and so he can go get a new permit.
Hmm.
You see how and so that was how the law was working, and that it brought up for me because I was already deep into Buddhism at that time. That whole concept. So here we are now: ownership, control, and agency.
Hmm.
The owner of who you are is the issue that the Buddha is raising. Who owns this thing? And here
Hmm.
you are talking about agency, something completely different. Okay. The
Right.
agent, in fact, is not the owner, but the agent can, let us say, make decisions and have things to do that affects who or whatever the owner would be. Okay. If you can get this concept down, then we can go into it a little bit more because um, the let us just talk about reincarnation for a little bit. The
Sure.
history
Sure.
of it, why it's good, where it comes from, and that kind of thing.
Hmm.
it appears, based upon some research that some other monks have done, that the whole concept of the self and rebirth and reincarnation, and especially karma and the results of karma, got started very solidly about 800 BC in the Upanishads, in the Rig Vedas, under the guise that at those times the Aryans had already invaded India from Mesopotamia, and that the Brahmins were unhappy with this because they were losing power and losing control. They used to own all the land. How did they own the land? Was because they were the priest, and they had convinced all the other people that these priestly duties were needed. So
Right.
when the Aryans came in, there was a new kind of conflict, and the Brahmins came up with the idea that, oh, we are Brahmin by birth. We are born Brahmin. We are Brahmin. You were not Brahmin. You were not born Brahmin. Therefore, only Brahmins can do Brahmin things like charge un-Brahmins a whole lot of money for a funeral.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
Only funerals can be done by Brahmins.
Right.
All right? Just like
Making the
only
niche.
funerals in
Yeah.
America have to be done by preachers.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Except anybody can be a preacher. All he has to do is be a good liar. Within Brahmanism, they've got only one lie. And that lie is, we are Brahmins and only we can do it. Here's how that comes about then. The Brahmins are Brahmins because they were born Brahmin, and they were born Brahmin because they must have been somehow good in the past. To where you were not
Right.
born Brahmin, that means that somehow you were not quite so good in the past, and therefore you were born at a lower level. This is where that stuff got started. It was a status symbol, and it was a money maker right from the get-go.
Right. So the people that are born into bad karmic circumstances, you must have done something to have warranted
Mm-hmm.
this
It's
particular
all
birth.
your
Right.
fault. Okay.
Right.
This is, in fact, the same concept with a different language to it as original sin.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Right.
Okay.
Right.
That something happened way deep, dark in your past, and now you're screwed. And not only that, but you need help. You need either the ceremonies or the prayers of the Brahmins, or if you're in someplace else, you need to be saved.
Mm-hmm. By us, not by them, but by
By
us.
them, by them.
Yeah.
No, they say you need to be saved. You've got to come to our creek,
Right. Right.
take a bath in cold, dirty water,
Mm-hmm.
in your clothing, vote for Donald Trump, and thou shalt be saved.
Right.
Oh, and pay some money. And pay
Right.
some money.
It'll get you there faster if you. Right.
Okay, so
Right.
that's where all of this came from,
Mm-hmm.
and that it's done worldwide under the ideas or the guise that there is something inside of each human being that is controllable by some magic entity like a common machine in the sky or some god or something like that. Now, you can see how ignorant humans kind of got that idea of personalizing everything. That when we were in children, we personalize our toys. We give our teddy bears names, Oscar
Mm-hmm.
or something, right?
Right.
We personalize things. When the little boy is playing with his truck, little truck like this, and he goes zoom, 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 in his mind, that's a real truck. Okay, so
Mm-hmm.
children, we grow up in a fantasy world because the world that we grow up is so ignorant that we have to make up a bunch of stuff. We don't understand things, and so we will see things wrongly. And that gives rise then to be for humans to be susceptible to older people who will lie to them, and we believe it. Okay. So this, and here's the reason also, when the lie is told that, oh, if you join our church, give us your money, and do this, that, and the other thing, then you can get a do-over. This life sucks, but next time will be okay.
Right. Right.
Okay. So it's a promise for the future.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, either the next life or heaven after you die or something like that. But you can see that built right into the culture too, in the sense of, okay, Billy, learn your ABCs, do your 1, 2, 3s. You're in the first grade now, and when you get a year's done of this, you guess what? You can go to this great big heaven in the sky called second grade.
Right. Right.
And when
Yeah.
you're in second grade, then the third, then okay. And so it's
Mm-hmm.
always promise of the future and promise of the future. And so the guy now eventually graduates from high school. Now he's got to go to college. He gets into college. He gets his bachelor's degree. Now there's graduate school or whatever. But eventually we get the job, and to nowhere is any of those next steps heaven. We
Right.
never get our reward. We are
So it's
always
always
going from one disappointment to the next disappointment to the next disappointment, and we never got what we were promised.
right. And this drives this whole chain of becoming, right? It's always I will
Always
be, I
becoming.
will be, I will
I
be,
will be.
right?
I will be. Exactly.
Yes. Yes. Right.
Exactly. All
So
right.
within the context of Buddhism, of course, within right view, there's the statement of, the mundane right view. There's the statement of there is karma, there are beings born spontaneously. Is this basically maybe a way of the Buddha laying out the fact that compared to the super mundane view, he was teaching these teachings to people that were already familiar with Hinduism, right? So this
Yes.
would fit into their worldview. So in some ways, karma, or in all ways, karma was a cultural carryover, not the true
Exactly. Now
teaching,
let's
right?
look at something else. In
Hmm.
in fact, that the Buddha was making. You just made a reference, by the way, to Sutra number 117 in the Great 40 and ordinary right view. There's more to it than that we need to look at to get an understanding, and that is that ordinary right view is basically marching orders for culture.
Hmm.
It's marching orders for our society, in the sense that if 100% of the people had 100% wrong view 100% of the time, we wouldn't have a culture.
Hmm.
We would have one dead warlord after another because his lieutenant just shot him. Okay.
Right. It's conventional in the conventional mechanics. This is how, you know.
No, actually, yeah, it's ultimately conventional in the sense of Darwinism of the dog eat dog world, or in our case, cannibalism,
Right.
animals eating animals, okay, eating
Right.
each other. So, um, we would have a chaos,
Hmm.
okay.
Hmm.
How did the very, very first human ever convince the very second human to do what he was told to do? Force.
Right.
Exactly. This is exactly what the first, or let us say, ordinary right view is based upon force.
Hmm.
If there is no force that's useful, then everyone will hold a wrong view. I generally talk about it from the perspective of that wrong view has a catchphrase or a motto. That phrase is, I can get away with it. I can get away with anything.
Right. Right.
Okay, I can kill cattle on this side of the river and come kill them on this side of the river. Nobody's going to do anything. Or I can drive by and shoot my gun and kill some child on the pavement and go off and I'll get away with it. Okay, this
Hmm.
is the whole idea. But basically, it's based in the ignorance of the person is really not getting away with anything because he was by his own desires and his own ignorance forced into doing that despicable act. But he wanted to do it because of his desires. Okay, so it was ignorant desire that forced him into it, and he thinks he's free to do it, but he's not free from doing it.
Right. And this loops back into the agency question, right? About sort of what's driving the, as you might call it, the human
Exactly.
machine, right? The mind machine. So from that point of view, if we take that as the example, when it comes to the inclination toward nibbana, the inclination toward liberation, um, is that would you be able to characterize it in such a way of saying that the inclination toward liberation is maybe a truer or more natural state for the mind? So it's, in other words, when it drops these, as you call them, so the force of delusion, right? The force of aversion, the force of whatever that's compelling someone to do the wrong action. When
Hmm.
they abandon the grasping of those things, is that essentially the mind in its natural state? Is that the, if you get what I'm saying, when you stopped
Yes.
fueling the machine, liberation is the natural result, the compassion is the natural result when you've stopped? Is that essentially how you'd?
Yes, absolutely. And not only that, but the point that you're making is integral with the Buddhist teaching in so many different places. Okay. Even the definition of the word nibbana points in that direction. Here's how the word nibbana points in that direction is because nibbana is known as the unconditioned,
Mm-hmm.
and that it also has to do with the quality of coolness in the sense that a barking dog, a wild dog, is barking, 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 he's hot.
Mm,
But if the dog stops barking and lays down on the porch and takes a nap, now the dog is nibbana. Now he's cool.
mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
When you have food in the pot or in the oven cooking, the heat of the fire makes it hot. It cooks the food. But as soon as the food comes out of the oven, like a pizza pie, this happens sometimes that people at the restaurant, they get their pizza pie, they take a bite of it and they burn the inside of their mouth, especially the cheese
Yes.
on the roof of the mouth. Okay. So the pizza needs to nibbana, and it nibbanas because it's no longer being conditioned by the heat of the oven.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, Western mentality, when they hear that concept of nibbana being unconditioned, they get the idea that it's unconditionable. There's a complete difference between now, currently unconditioned, and unconditionability means that it cannot possibly be conditioned. And this is not the right way of looking at it. That nibbana is when things are unconditioned.
Right. Right. From that framework or that point of view, I was wondering if you could touch upon briefly. So we just spoke about how essentially when the grasping is given up, when this attempt to fulfill the future looking desires or the aversion, whatever, when those are abandoned, there's the natural letting go and there's nibbana, right? But I suppose my question would be, how from that framework, how did the grasping arise in the first place? How did this first chain of becoming, or is this something that the Buddha just refused to comment on because it's not worth speculating about?
Well, actually, you can see it in technology. Over the course of your lifetime, automobile manufacturers have made their automobiles smarter and smarter. Laptops have been around since, gosh, the 1980s. But laptops nowadays are nothing like they were in the old days. Okay.
Right.
Uh, the, the kind of laptop that would cost $2,000, $3,000 in 1995, if they manufactured such a poor piece of equipment, it would be sold for $25 now.
Right.
Okay. Here's where I'm going with this, and
I
that is that things get started and build up. We start out as children
mm,
and we build up. When we start out as children, we start out at a very low basic level. A basic, let us say, a tender infant doesn't even know correctly how to manipulate his hands. They put up a mobile, and the baby will do this kind of thing. But grasping, reaching, touching, this kind of behavior, tender infants don't even have that. They're that ignorant.
Right. It's a spontaneous sort of
Right.
action that then has a feedback loop, right? It's
But
processed
it
and then,
does have a feedback loop. Okay,
right,
so
right.
over time, there is an educational process. Unfortunately, many lessons are learned ignorantly and then stored as natural outcomes and used over and over again when in fact they need to be revisited, they need to be tweaked.
Right.
Okay, just because in 1995 I had a laptop then doesn't mean that I am doomed to use that particular laptop, or at least nothing better than that now.
Mm-hmm.
Just like when you were 3 years old, you were doomed to know the knowledge of a 3-year-old.
Right.
But
Right.
most of the adults that vote for Donald Trump are still doomed to live like 3-year-olds.
Well, you triggered a very funny feeling when you mentioned even the first sentence about this idea of technology and the advancement, because you know it triggered within my mind, right, this a sort of fractal picture of this development, right? You can even look at, for example, scientists are still baffled how the first life came to be animated and sort of, when we look at the development of a planet, and it's a totally blind process, right? It's just things happening in such a way that, for example, this bundle of organic matter manages to grasp onto something, this bundle of, and over time, right, there's the consciousness of an
It
organism.
all has to do with valence electrons. When
It's
you either
yes,
don't have enough, or you have too many, then things fit together and there's
right,
no end to it. There's just
right.
no end to these molecules sticking
And
together.
it goes all the way down the line, right? All the way down
Right.
to, we're going to see it probably with artificial intelligence, right? Where eventually it will have this self-referencing consciousness that will be able to develop a self construct eventually,
Let's not
presumably.
go into the area of AI right now because AI has something that we don't have,
Do you think it's
and it will always have it. It's called an off switch.
that's a good point. Yeah,
Yeah,
right,
AI always has an off switch.
right,
It has to have energy. But guess what? You've got a kind of an off switch. It just operates differently in the sense that if you don't have enough energy, then you will wind down and die. However, you know that, and it's part of the built-in system that you have a self-preservation instinct built in
right.
to make sure that you get the resources that you need.
Evolutionary thread.
AI
Yeah,
is trying to solve a particular function, and all of its attention is on this function, and it does not have self-referencing about the machine because that AI software is going to run on almost any hardware.
right, right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And,
So there's
and,
still
and
the, yeah, there's the biological self-preservation system that runs, you could say, most of the human experience, right? If there's not sort of attention given to that aspect.
there's no reason to do that. What we want, in fact, is for the robots to interact with humans the way humans want the robots to interact. And if
Right.
the robot doesn't interact the way that the human wants, he just sends it back to the factory.
Right. Yeah. If you could briefly, it's kind of a good segue to the next thing I was wondering about. One of Buddhadasa's perhaps most controversial statements, right? And this is not the controversial part, that jati refers to birth, not to rebirth, right? That this term is just birth, birth. It's not
I
a
Is that
description of.
Vika Buddhadasa's controversy?
I
I
meant
thought it
the
was mine.
controversy. Well, let's just call it then the whole bundle, right, of controversy about the concept of, I remember that Buddhadasa had famously declared that he, in no rebirth, right, that rebirth was this concept that was future driven. It was driven on the concept of lives continuing, that birth comes once, death comes once. I was wondering if you could elaborate on either your or his or both positions about the idea of um, is there such thing, again, this is probably speculative here, but beyond death, is there a continuation of awareness in any form? Because obviously the human mind struggles with the concept of void, right? We can't wrap our
Okay.
heads around the idea of no
Are you
sensory.
are you planning on dying in the next 24 hours?
uh, I plan on dying at some point, hopefully not in the next 24 hours. But obviously it's a perennial question for human
Okay.
beings
Well, if
that's
you get
very
24 hours notice, call me and we'll discuss it then.
okay. I'll put that on my my list if I ever get notice.
Okay.
For now, I'll focus, as you're probably suggesting here, I'll focus on the next immediate moments of my life as they're coming and going.
Now we're getting someplace. You see, if in fact all of life's troubles
Hmm.
have to do with the fact that the individual is having unwholesome thoughts in his mind, regardless of whatever they are in this present moment, then the only time that we're going to be able to do something about those unwholesome thoughts in the mind is in this present moment.
Yes,
Not
yes.
next week, not even 24 hours from now.
Or 80
So,
years.
or 80 years, or how about 300 or 3,000 years?
Right.
Okay. So here's the point about the actual teachings of the Buddha is that it's about immediate, it's about right now. And that means that the past and the future, even the immediate past and the immediate future, is still past and the future. Midterm past and midterm future is still past and future, and very, very long term past and very long term future is still past and future.
Hmm.
That's the
Right.
important point, is to recognize that. um, Here's an example of that. Out of Sutra number 38, Sati, son of a fisherman, thought that it is consciousness that runs in circles from this life to this place to the next, experiencing the results of good and bad actions. Now, actually, in the Pali, there is a Pali phrase that can be translated directly as here and there. I think it's kata kata.
Hmm.
Okay. Go experiences here and there. That means that a young man can have a particular life, let us say in New York City, and then he takes a job and he goes to Chicago, and he's now living in Chicago.
Hmm.
Is he the same person in Chicago that he was in New York?
Presumably, but it depends, I guess, on what level we're talking. I mean,
I'm talking about real. I'm not
right,
talking
right,
about the clinging that humans do, that mom would say, "Oh, he's my son. He was my son in New York, and he was my son
right.
in Chicago."
It's like a
Let's look
river.
at it a
He's,
little bit differently than that. His
yeah,
entire day's activities are completely changed now. The people
right,
he's around have completely changed now.
right,
The things that he used to think about, in fact, he probably dumped half of his belongings in New York because it was too much trouble to bring them with him. Okay, so
right,
now he's got a whole bunch of new products. He's got a new house to live in. All kinds of things have changed.
right.
All right. So there's going to be some things that are different and some things that have changed, and some things are going to remain the same.
Hmm.
But we can't just grab hold of the things that remain the same and say, "Oh, that's him."
Right. And if we
No,
investigate it on a
that in
maybe a
fact,
finer, yeah,
he got, while he was in New York, he was extremely frustrated with his boss. Now in Chicago, he's not frustrated. Okay.
right,
Frustration or non frustration, that's different. Okay. So here's the thing now. If in fact, the man who moved from New York to Chicago gives up his past and no longer remembers or thinks about or pines for or wants New York, and he is completely sufficient to live in Chicago, Isn't that exactly the same thing as, in fact, New York was a past life 2,000 years ago, or maybe even 50 years ago?
Right.
It's the same thing.
Right.
It doesn't matter. Okay. The
Mm-hmm.
point is that things happen new. Everything is reborn.
Mm-hmm.
And the word jati, by the way, does not mean birth exactly the way that the English language word means birth. And in fact, even the English language word for birth doesn't mean birth.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, it means a hammock or it means a bay. A berth is where a ship parks.
Right.
Okay, and when it does, it's in its womb.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Ta-da!
So
Okay,
so we
so
could
actually
say,
we
yeah.
could say the birth of the blues, the
Mm-hmm.
birth of a nation. You
Mm-hmm.
hear that used all the time like that. And so, let us say, but in an old book, if you read the word birth in an old book, then you have to only have one definition for it rather than having to figure out from a choice of a wide variety of definitions and what was it meant at that particular time. That
Right.
in fact, the word jati does not mean birth at all. What it means is start.
Mm-hmm.
Just like the word birth often means the word to start, like the birth of the blues, the birth of a nation,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's the start of it. So why does Bhikkhu Bodhi and the other translators translate the word jati as the word rebirth, absolutely intentionally placing magic in a word that originally had no magic in it? The answer to that is because that's where the original translators did it.
Mm-hmm.
I.B. Homer, Riles Davies, and a few others. There was a German. This was all done from 1880 to about 1920 in the formation of the Polytech Society, where these were called scholars, university professor kind of linguistics. And they got a hold of the Pali Canon, but they didn't. All they had was the Pali Canon. They had no understanding of what it meant, nor did they know the language, and so all of that had to be figured out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So if you let's do it this way. Imagine that there was a German uh, research professor scientist who was doing stuff in physics at the top level, beyond PhD level physics, okay? And he's writing it in German. He's going to make a bomb. All right.
Right. Right.
And the Americans want that document.
Mm-hmm.
Who are they going to get to translate it? Are they going to just take it to some college professor who has seen a bit of German?
Probably not.
Are they going to take it to someone who is really, really skilled in German? In fact, German's his native language, and he's also quite excellent in English.
We would hope.
Or do you want someone who actually is a physicist who understands what's being translated?
Right. And knows
And
the
if
languages.
And so,
Hopefully.
if you have all three, if you have someone who is excellent in German, excellent in English, and excellent in physics, now you might get a decent translation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We haven't had that yet from the Pali Canon.
Right.
All we have are people who are experts in English. Stop.
Right. I mean,
Full
we
stop.
it's a lot of words, right? We have obviously a lot of people
An
assume
entire
that
language.
dukkha is solely suffering, right? That this is the only translation, that there's not maybe other
How
ways to
Christian of them.
exactly, right? It's so that's what I'm thinking too, is that there's a lot of this cultural baggage that comes along with the way that we try to make analogs of these words, right? That may
Mhm.
not have existed, probably didn't exist with the original Buddhist intention of them when they were recorded, right?
Right.
And
And
yeah.
so we have a Christianized, magical view of the teachings of the Buddha right from the get go.
Hmm.
Now, here's something that we could say in this regard, and that is that Christianity is Christianity because of the story of Christianity. The
Hmm.
story of who Jesus was, the story of his birth, his life, and his death, and who he
Right.
was. And if you take that story away from Christianity, what has Christianity got left?
The bones of a monotheistic religion. Just that there's a creator figure, which is obviously shared by many other
No,
traditions.
that's part of the story. Take that story out too.
Well, you take the whole creator out, you're saying, if you take that out?
Yeah. Take the story out. Right.
Well, you
Heavens,
probably get
hell,
reality,
God,
I
devil.
suppose.
Well, no, but within Christianity, there's no reality then because it's all story.
Absolutely, right. By
Okay.
reality, I
In
mean,
the sense that
yeah,
the answer to
yeah.
that would be what would be left if you took the story out of it would be the teachings of Jesus.
Right. So you're saying, oh, I see. Okay, I thought you were saying to remove entirely Jesus as a
No, not
figure from it.
return, not remove
You're
Jesus,
saying
the
to remove the
story of
narrative, right? The whole narrative with the creator and everything, right? So you'd basically get something extremely similar to Buddhism about compassion and about removing the self interest from things and removing,
uh-huh.
right?
Everything about what needs to be done in order to get to a heaven without the concepts of heaven. And guess what? Jesus wasn't around long enough. The people that he dealt with were not very smart. And he complained about them in
Yeah.
the sense they don't get it,
Hmm.
which means that Jesus then died and nobody ever got it because Jesus did not present them with a method or a way or an intellectual framework.
Hmm.
He just gave parables and just went around doing good, and stories began to grow.
Right.
Okay. Now let's look at that in the same concept of the Buddha. There is a lot of stories about the Buddha. There's a lot of magical stories out there. But if you took all the stories away from the Buddha, even take the Buddha out of it, what do
Hmm.
you have left is the teachings of the Buddha, including the method and the way.
Right.
The story is not necessary at all.
Right.
That in fact, the teachings of the Buddha can be taught and people can get enormous benefit out of it without ever using the name Buddha
Hmm. Hmm.
or Asia or anything. Okay, but
Right.
it does because of the historical context and all of that. So let's get back to something that we were talking about originally in this point, and that is that about um, noble right view then is that we're going to take care and investigate this particular moment
Hmm.
to where past and future is what ordinary Buddhism is about. And that it is basically going back to that point about how can Mr. Primitive A get Mr. Primitive B to do anything that Mr. Primitive A wants to do. Okay. Your answer was force. In other words, the group of people that we will just for humor's sake call the authoritarians, and those that have wrong view, we'll call them the kids.
Hmm. Hmm.
Okay, and the kids think that they can get away with anything, and the authority says, no, you can't. We've got rules here at this place of authority, like a school or a church or a society, whatever authorities, they're there. And the kids will come back and says, I can do anything I want to. I can get away with it. I can cheat on my taxes. I don't have to do what you tell me to do. And the authority says, yes, you do have to do what we're trying to do here. We're trying to build a pyramid, The king's wanting to go to heaven and he needs his pyramid. And without you, he can't make that pyramid.
Hmm.
You're going to have a really tough life and death if you don't help us do that pyramid. Okay. So basically what happens then is that there are several kinds of forces that are applied by the authorities on the kids. The first one is direct force.
Mm-hmm.
Then we bring in the indirect force. Why? Because the authority can't be standing there with his whip or his army or his
Right.
cops all the time. We're going to go hire a priest.
Mm-hmm.
And what is the priest going to do? The priest is going to say to the kids, you can't get away with it. Even if you can get away with it from the authority here, we've got a magic Jesus who's going to bust your ass if you don't do what this authority tells you to do. And this
Right.
is where the magic story comes in. Magic is that which is an unidentified authority that will punish you for going against the things that real authorities told you don't do.
Right. Right.
Now we do that with kids. In fact, in Buddhist cultures, we still have the 5 precepts, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Basically, what the authorities are doing is they're trying to do the kids a favor. They're trying to teach the kids the distinction between right and wrong according to the authorities.
Right.
But the kids are too stupid to see the distinction between right and wrong. So the authorities have to add an extra weight on the scale. They have to put an extra thumb on the scale in the sense that it's not just happenstance or just a sequence of events or cause and effect that's going to guide the karma. We're going to put our thumb on the scale by telling you, oh no, we've got a story here. And the story is if you do badly, you're going to go to hell.
Right.
And so it basically is a control mechanism to control people
Mm-hmm.
while the boss with the whip is not standing there.
Right.
In other words, we can make the slaves work in the field without having the bullwhip in the field with the slaves. The slaves will go out into the
Mm.
field and till the harvest all on their own, give all the products to the boss,
Yep.
just so that the boss won't beat them.
As a maybe a very sloppy analogy here, what I was thinking about, right, is of course, so the Buddha spoke about some of these views as being right view, but the mundane form of right view, right? So the one that if lay people back then they didn't know anything about any of these, let's say they didn't do any kind of formal practice, they didn't actually investigate the nature of the mind, but these are the things they're told are good to do, they're going to do them. In some way, it makes me think almost of how if one owns a dog, right? One has a pet dog, and there's a road nearby, one might put up an electric fence for the dog so that the dog doesn't need to know because the dog may not understand, right? That there's a road there and cars go down it. But obviously, it's done in some ways for the better interest of the dog, even though it's not an accurate reflection of uh, again, this falls flat because there's the sense that there's this lurking danger there. But essentially, right, if the Buddha had this whole picture of the mind and how it functioned and the grasping and the nature of the hindrances and everything, and he was trying to teach other beings to get closer to the state of their natural mind or natural liberation, it would only make sense, right, that you would give the most rudimentary rules for them to follow, even if they don't know why. If you tell them this is good, this leads to good things, they're more inclined to get closer to.
If it's benign, then this teacher will assist the students to do things that are in their best self-interest.
Right.
But normally, the authorities do not have the self-interest of the kids. They
Right.
have their own best self-interest in
It can
mind.
be used both ways, right, to lead to a certain end. Even,
Mhm.
so that the people themselves that are being maybe manipulated may not know what that end is, but of course it can be framed as this is good, this is bad, right? There's sort of and of course in the supramundane right view, then the things would be, as you said in an earlier conversation, you said there's no need for the authority to catch you because you catch yourself. You are doing it because you are inwardly aware of what's right and wrong based on your own knowledge of being or whatever you'd like to call it, right? You have this.
That's exactly correct. But there is a hook to it
Hmm.
in the sense that the authorities want to teach you what is right and what is wrong, so that they don't have to stand there over you all the time to make sure that you know what is right and what is wrong and do it according to them.
Yeah.
So there is a mechanism that is built in with each one of us that Eric Berne calls the parent ego state,
Mm-hmm.
and that Sigmund Freud calls it the superego, and the Buddha calls it Sila Bhatta Paramasa, and that it's instinctual in the sense that um, if you do something when you're a little kid and you get really hurt, then you're going to remember that and you're not going to do it anymore.
Right.
Okay. This is a self-preservation mechanism. And so, in that regard, this superego that we're talking about is instinctual. That in fact, the instinct that it comes from can be traced right into the the herding instinct or our nesting instinct, in the sense that if you're going to join this herd, if you're going to join this nest, then you have to abide by the rules of this nest. If you
Mm-hmm.
can't abide by the rules of this nest, then you have to leave the nest. And if you leave the nest, it may be dangerous out there. And so this, it's so old in the sense of primitive that it goes all the way back to fish. It's not just sheep and goats who have this herding instinct. Even schools of fish will school together for self-preservation, right? So, in that regard, you do what you were told to do because it's part of the self-preservation instinct. In other words, if you go against what the authority wants, the authority may kill you,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
or at least he's going to threaten to kill you. And to bringing up fear then of death. Okay, so this is what a lot of that is going on about is that it is instinctual behavior for us to automatically, over time as children, build up experiences in a form of rules or to-do list, or thou shalt do this, and you can call it precepts, commandments,
Mm-hmm.
or whatever. Now, in the old days of psychology, when I was in psychology, the term that they used was tape. Playing the old tapes. That's because everybody back then, they had cassettes and 8 tracks and whatnot like that for music
Yep.
recording, and so we play these old tapes in our heads about how things ought to be, how things
Mm-hmm.
should be, how things would be. This is actually then the ordinary right view that we have taken on and put in and plugged into shape, that then runs our lives when we're adults. And we brought those things in based upon the feeling. In other words, if mom yelled at little Johnny for drawing pictures on the wall,
Mm-hmm.
he is going to remember that, and that's going to affect him later in life,
Right.
to the
Right.
point that he may, in fact, hate graffiti so much that he actually spends quite a lot of money on paint to paint up the sides of buildings where other people have put graffiti, simply
Plays
because
out.
he's hanging
Yeah.
on to that thing that he got fussed at when he was a kid when he drew on the wall. This
Right.
is how the human mind works.
So it.
So,
Yeah.
but he's not quite aware of, even if he remembers that, that's not a big enough hit for him to say, therefore, because I recognize why I'm going and painting over everybody else's wall art, that means that maybe now I can stop doing it. That takes even a deeper level of insight.
Right. So
Okay.
obviously there have been many beings, throughout, let's say, human civilization or whatever, that have had degrees of wisdom about the truth of their own mind or about the truth of their being or whatever, and they've tried in many ways to teach people benevolently about what's right and wrong. But it
Mm.
seems that the real problem that we face is that this giant ball of what we call right view in, let's say, the traditional Western context we've kind of, we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater in some ways when we say, oh, all values are bad, right? Because obviously some of those values that we've packaged into the unconscious, or the parent ego structure, whatever, clearly are things that have helped us to be able to civilize it, to have a civilization that we can communicate in and things like that. But
Right. Doesn't
right,
every child want to throw the shackles of authoritarianism off so that they can revert back to wrong view and get away with it?
right, right. So in some ways we need this balance of we need to find a way to actually confer the right way of thinking about the world that isn't driven by force, right? It's driven by, hey, look at how pleasant and full of ease it is to live in this more, wholesome, connected way, instead of, if you don't do this right, we're going to lock you in the slammer, and the whole nine
Hmm.
yards, right? So that sort of seems to be the problem, is that obviously we grow up quite wary of things that are called, cultural values or moral values, because we often see it as being, the whole thing is this giant web of kind of enslavement. But really a lot of it, some of it at least, was obviously packaged into that to not only help people survive, but to help them get closer to the principles that we could aspire to, right? If we actually had the right circumstances and conditions in our lives to put in that practice, and if that
Right.
makes sense, right?
It does. It does exactly. So what you find that the sum total of our culture is a dialogue between wrong view and ordinary right view.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Or another way of saying it is that it's a dialogue or a situation between the kids and the parents, or worse still, between the prisoners and the prison guards.
Right.
Okay. Except that in the case of the prison and the prison guards, guess what? Everybody's in prison.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Everybody's in prison, even the authorities, because
Right.
if the authorities are not there in the prison to guard the prison, to make sure that the ones who have wrong view are behaving themselves, because the authorities have got all this work to do to keep those guys in line, they're in prison also.
Right. I had a buddy who was a prison guard who said the exact same thing. He said in prison, everybody's in prison, because that was why he got out of it. He said it was just this huge, the suffering just runs your life when you're confronted with that day in and day out, this reality of what's going on, not only between the guards and the prisoners, but the prisoners between themselves, the authorities to the prison guards who are doing the grunt work, and it's
And so it's always this and this. Even when a new prisoner comes in, he has to
Mhm.
come in under all of the other prisoners and under all of the guards.
Right,
Okay. And
right.
so it always is a pecking order. Basically, what we talk about in the sense of the Sangha is the Sangha is like any organization without any pecking order,
Hmm.
that we're all in this together.
Right. And an attempt to actually actualize this idea of having right view and values without the stick constantly striking, right? So
Exactly.
it's a benevolent way of trying to organize, a microcosm of a society, right? It's a
Hmm.
group of people.
Now, let's get back a little bit to the concept of let us use the word rebirth,
Sure, sure.
because it's actually quite valuable for students of Buddhism to really understand what let us say the medieval definition of rebirth is. Very
Hmm.
handy to do that. We can start off at the top level, or the worst possibility would be reincarnation, in the sense that a being takes this body dies, and that being goes on, and he then eventually takes on a different kind of body depending upon the woeful state that he went into, an animal body or being born in hell. I don't know what a hell body is, but in any case, um, you have these various modes of being, and one would be that he can come back and become a human being again.
Hmm.
This is the whole concept of a permanent self that is everlasting. It is eternal. Or if it's not eternal, then it is semi-eternal in the sense that eventually it may come to a death, but that's so far off into the future that we can pretend that semi-eternalism and eternalism are basically the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's another concept, and that concept is that upon the eradication and the breakup and the death of the body, the existing being is annihilated. This is called annihilationism, and this is basically what you have as modern day atheism, that
Right.
I am what I am, and that's all that I am until I die, and then I'm not.
And then it's just blackness forever, and there's nothing.
But we don't know. The
Right.
agnostic is I don't know. The atheist is at least taking the position that no evidence.
Right.
You see,
Right.
that's an important quality that we can take on the side note, and that is that does lack of evidence count as evidence of absence?
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Right.
guess what? I don't know of any scientific experiment or any court of law that will say that lack of evidence is evidence of absence. That in science, lack of evidence means you got to do the experiment over again. You got to tweak it. You got to keep going with it. In court, if the prosecutor walks in and says, Your Honor, this guy's guilty. I know he's guilty. We've seen all the evidence, but right now we don't have any. There's no evidence that this guy did what he said he did, but please punish him for it anyway. What's the
Right.
judge going to do? He's going to throw it out of court. Well, why don't we, as good, proper magistrates of our own lives, throw out those things that have no evidence?
Right.
But the promise of that evidence is sufficient. No evidence of a heaven, but promise of a heaven. Okay, and so this is where desire or lust comes in the sense of wanting things that we don't have. Well, wanting things that we don't have, almost always the things that we want that we don't have are done to make our life easier or better somehow, and maybe even that this is like in the United States, guns. Why do people buy guns? What's the number one thing that they will say the reason why they buy a gun?
Uh, self-defense.
Exactly. In other words, fear.
Right. Right.
Materialism is an instinct, and we instinctually attract materialism because those material goods are designed to keep us safe and secure. In other words, materialism is an instinct in the service of the self-preservation instinct.
Mm-hmm.
And so we gather things up. Some of the things that we gather would be like a house. Why do we have a house? Why do people live in a house?
It's all survival, self-preservation.
Survival.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So all of this stuff works out in survival. Therefore, when we start adding concepts, we add concepts for that same reason as survival. This is what we call spiritual materialism, or actually just it's a non-material materialism, is when we gather up identities, who we are, we grasp and cling to political parties, nations, um, religions,
Mm-hmm.
belief systems. We cling to these because it gives us a sense of security and well-being.
Right.
Okay, they're false because they don't give a sense of well-being. For instance, someone says, "Oh, I'm a Democrat because I think the Democrats will do a better job than the Republicans." Fine. Then that means if you watch the news about the Democrats, anytime that something happens good for the Democrats, you'll feel good, and anything that happens that's bad for the Democrats, you'll feel bad. And so now you're on an emotional roller coaster just because you've attached to somebody else's wagon, and that wagon goes up and down and up and down and up and down, and you have to go up and down too.
Right.
Sorry, folks. Let the Democrat Party do what it's going to do. It's not my party. Therefore, I don't have to go up and down with my party.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is how we begin to see that attachments to organizations, rites, rules, rituals, concepts, materialism, we do that, and we also build up a set of rules about how we should live.
Mm-hmm.
And these are all then the basic instincts of self-preservation and sensual input or sensual desire, which would be materialism. And then the nesting instinct is the instinct of uh, getting along, getting along, doing what you're told to do, etc. The nesting instinct. And then the last one is the territorial instinct, is our attachments to concepts. Now, the dogs, they have real territory. That you're talking about the wire for the dog to keep. Well, these dogs, they know where their territorial boundaries are. They've got that
Right.
all sussed out. I don't
Right.
have to go tell them to don't go there. They stop at the road. Uh, but humans, we don't have physical territory so much anymore as we have intellectual territory.
Mm-hmm.
And an intellectual territory would be like you could say each different thing that you know in the sense of a subject, then would be a different territory. For instance, mathematics would be a territory, but inside that territory, there's a lot of little sub-territories, et cetera, like this. And so the territorial stuff for the human is quite vast.
Right.
But we do get attached to our territory in the sense of my political party, my company, my job, my uh, political beliefs,
Mm-hmm.
all of this kind of stuff defines who we are, and that the hallmark of that territorial instinct is our nest, us, versus them, the outsiders. And so, what we do to define our territory means that our territory is not that territory out there.
Right. Right.
Right. So, we draw these boundaries in the mind, and this is all done instinctually, ignorantly, instinctually.
Mm-hmm.
So now it's time for us to start unraveling all of those belief systems,
Right.
because almost always those belief systems are causing us trouble. For instance, if you were a Democrat and you're laying in bed, you'll think of, well, what happened today? Oh, I've got to go to NBC, or oh, I've got to go, you know.
Right.
But if we lay in the bed and we say, Democrats, yeah, I guess they're okay today. I
Mm-hmm.
don't need them. They don't need me. And I don't have to go do anything. I don't
Right.
have to check on the news.
Right. The conceptual can verge obviously into the material on that level, right? With the mind matter thing, where okay, the mere idea of something can spark a real, as you were mentioning, right, about the idea of uprooting or weeding out the harmful thoughts, the aversive thoughts, these things like that, because they also have real consequences, right? Even like thinking of a spider or snake can trigger the same reaction, chemically that we'd have for a real spider or snake, right? And it
Hmm.
goes all the way down the spectrum with all kinds of, you know, anything from the idea of, my country or, my religion, obviously, all the way through with, the idea of debt, the idea of losing a home, the idea of, so obviously some of them can have
We stayed
value, but
terrified then by our ideas.
right,
Our
right,
ideas, any individual who has ideas is terrified by those ideas.
right. Because
An
we can play
example
with
that
them.
I found out back in the 1970s,
Hmm.
when I was getting into psychology and this kind of stuff, it eventually dawned on me as a computer scientist in those days that I can dream up, concoct, or mentally design many, many hundreds of different programs or databases or all kinds of stuff. And yet I cannot manufacture any of those things. That my mental um, manufacturing, putting together uh, the conceptualized mind is way, way ahead of reality in many ways. For instance, you talked about AI. guess what? AI is nowhere near what people in general think it is. Why?
Right.
Because all
Right.
they think it is has to do with fear of it.
Right. Or wild dreams about what it could do, or
Mhm.
yeah.
And
Right.
so
Right.
some people are going wild with how marvelous their wild dreams are, and other people are going wild with how terrible it's going to be.
But either way, it's like this imaginary drug, right? It's just
Exactly.
right.
Which means now that these concepts
Hmm.
out of the territorial instinct, these rights, rules, rituals, laws, ways of doing things, which we could actually call critical mind. And that critical mind basically is the authority of that uh, right ordinary view. Right ordinary view is a set of laws, rights, rituals, the way things that should be in order to have a perfect world, except that they never get a perfect world.
Right.
There's no such
Because
thing as a perfect world.
right. Because then, of course,
And
trying to impose it on other people leads to
right, exactly. You were just
right.
about to get, you just made my next point. And the reason for that is because the authorities think their perfect world is being able to control all of those other people who have wrong view. And
Right.
all of the
Right.
wrong view people, they think their perfect world is to get rid of those authorities.
Yeah, because when you set up this conceptual divide, right, of like, okay, so if somebody sits down and says, right, I've put on paper the 10 rules of the world, the 10 commandments of the world, and somebody says, well, number 9, maybe we could tweak it this way. Obviously, if you feel that your way is the true way, you in your mind, you have no other choice but to crush that opposition to your perfect commandment, right? Because otherwise you're letting this whatever evildoer corrupt your system, right? It's sort of a
Precisely.
you've set up your boundary, people come over your boundary, but you made the boundary, right? So you're defending this
Mhm.
boundary that you've set up for yourself. Right. It's a so I this is really fascinating stuff, and I appreciate it. I just had two maybe brief questions about very like practical practice related questions. So I've obviously been practicing for this last week on a very stripped down version of meditation compared to what I used to do, which is the method that you were encouraging here with just staying with the pleasant feelings, lengthening the breath. And I had the two questions. The first of which was sometimes when I'm doing this practice, about 20, maybe 15, 20 minutes in, I get to a point where the piti and the sukha build to a very, very strong level. There's the whole body is sort of radiating with these feelings. The trouble is that at that point, I start to feel that the breath is becoming the abdomen becomes sort of tense. There's a tension that sort of is building, and it becomes taking longer breaths feels either difficult or very rigid with the breathing. And I was wondering if that's normal, and if it's not, then what you would recommend to work with that.
Well, it would be if you're actually breathing, let us say in a new way,
Hmm.
then you're going to be using a few muscles of the body in a new way,
Right.
which means that those muscles now need to be exercised in a new way, and that there's going to be a certain amount of muscle fatigue with that.
Hmm.
Part of your job is to notice this, to notice what's happening with the body and make the adjustments that you need. And you can make adjustments with the way that you breathe. For instance, you can breathe in a more relaxed way. If you're beginning to see that the relaxed breathing that you have, in fact, does have a bit of tension to it, then experiment to find a little bit more relaxed way of breathing.
Hmm. So you're
This is
working with it.
not
Yeah.
it's not rocket science, okay?
Right.
It's not. But we
Right.
have the idea, oh, I must be doing something wrong because I'm feeling tension in my long, deep breathing. No, you're doing something wrong because you're beginning to see things that are changing in a way. And
Right. And
so,
there's this reaction to it. Yeah.
right, always the not liking is there in the sense
Yes.
of, oh no,
Yes.
now what's wrong?
Right. And the thing is that in that moment, it's a very strong feeling of liking, and it's sort of I'm noting as it's going through, I'm noting how pleasurable the whole thing is, right? Because it reaches this point where it's the whole body feels simultaneously very light, very airy, but also obviously it's radiating with this pleasure. And there's sort of, then the thought creeps in, well, gee, my abdomen's pretty tight. Something's like, maybe there's some key that I'm not turning, right? And I guess this is where you're saying, hey, just be with it and work with that sensation as it arises, right? This
Or
is
play with it rather than
play
work.
with it. Yeah.
Yeah, don't
Right.
work with it, play with it.
Okay, I like this idea. And related to that topic, I was wondering, so I come from when I used to do this other method of practice, it was primarily staying with the nostril, with the breath at the nostril. And as the meditation went on, you were encouraged to sort of include the sensory data from the environment around you. So trying to include along with the breath, the whatever sounds are ambient, whatever feelings are going through the body, mental formations. I was wondering if you have a kind of a preference for if you think that is a skillful thing to do, or if you think that there's sort of benefit of holding sort of a field of awareness with anything that comes into it, or if you feel that it's more important to stay kind of exclusively focused on the motion of the breath and the accompanying pleasurable feelings.
All right. The answer to that is that we were using the breath basically to get out of the sixth sense that we spend most of our time with, which is the thinking mind, the turning mind, the conceptualizing mind. And so by watching the breath, we're actually spending quite a number of mind moments now, not thinking and conceptualizing and giving ourselves a hard time, critical thinking and all of that, but we're actually now in the experience of sensual input, in this case, touch.
Mm-hmm.
As I breathe in and as I breathe out, I can feel all kinds of things in the sense of touch on the body. Now, normally when people are, let us say, in meditation session, they have the eyes closed and they try to find a quiet environment. In fact, I have seen meditation retreats standing in the back of the room or sitting in the back of the room, and someone coughs, and it looks like a whack-a-mole machine just went off. This one moved to that one.
Yeah.
Everybody jumps because of that cough, okay, because it had gotten very, very quiet.
Right.
But this practice is not for sitting on the floor in a quiet place. This is to get the mind cleaned out so that, in fact, we can be in sensory input, because that's the only way you can be here now is in the senses.
Right.
You can see what's happening right now. You can hear what's happening right now. You can feel the sense of touch. You can feel the sense of the body's posture. You can feel the breeze. You can feel the touch of the cloth. There's so much happening in this present moment by the senses, but we're not generally paying any attention to all of that because we're stuck in this number 6 sense in the head.
Mm-hmm.
And so the whole quality is in making the shift out of the head or out of conceptualized thinking into the here now of bodily sensations, bodily awareness. And if we can really do that for top quality first place or whatever like that, once we get able to do that, then we should be able to get up off of the meditation cushion and find our way out of the room, and in fact find our way around the day while we're still in that marvelous state that we got ourselves into while we were sitting in seclusion.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because now we're just going to open more of the senses and to be here more in the present moment with the eyes and with the ears and with everything in the sensual awareness.
Right.
Okay, so this is actually one of the things that we want to do. We actually want to wake up the body. That's exactly how to talk about it. Why do we say it, waking up the body? It's because now we're beginning to pay attention to the body. We're actually getting sensory awareness. Okay, that in fact on your body right now, there's probably more than one place that itches. Are you
Mm-hmm.
aware of any of those places? How can, in other
Mildly. Just down at the
okay,
left
so
ankle.
exactly. So you can feel the feet on the floor. You can feel the knees. You can feel the touch of the cloth on the legs. You
Mhm.
can feel the shoulders, the weight of the sweater on the shoulders. You can feel all of that kind of stuff, but we don't pay attention to that. First off, because there is so much sensory awareness, little kids, in fact, are almost overwhelmed by the amount of sensory input that they have.
Mhm.
That they're looking at, in fact, that the problem with autism is that the child who is labeled as autistic merely is having trouble dealing with all of the sensory input that he has. That's why you'll see them in the corner doing this, rocking back and
Mhm.
forth, because there's just too much going on.
Right. Right.
And that the autistic child hasn't learned how to shut that stuff off. Normal kids learn how to shut that stuff down so that they can get more direction because they're not having to deal with so much sensory input. Well, guess what? In that regard, the autistic child, when he grows up, may be better off than the ordinary person because he's not shut down. He's still experiencing his reality of sensory input, to where most of us, we've shut it down. We've gone into the head. We're not thinking about it.
Right.
While the child is doing A, B, C, he's not thinking about his butt hurts.
Mhm. Mhm.
Okay.
Right.
But the
So,
autistic child is having trouble A, B, C because his butt hurts.
right. Yeah, it's all being jumbled. So when we're in, like, let's say, having an actual session or just, a dedicated practice time, um, I know that some teachers talk, they have differing views about this, right? Some teachers will say that in order to reach the first jhana, somebody has to exclude everything else, right? All other sensory input except for the one sensation that they're focusing
People
on.
who are talking like that just
Yeah,
simply do not know the definition of the word jhana. They don't know
right.
what they're talking about. The
So it's an
Buddha,
opening, right? Yeah.
it's an opening. It's
Hmm.
not a closing down. It is
Hmm.
definitely an opening. That in fact, it's exactly the opposite of deep meditation that seems to be the hallmark, or that which Western mentality thinks that because people are sitting in the meditation hall still and quiet, if they're being really good at meditation, that means they're getting more still and more quiet and more still and more quiet, and almost to the point that now they're dead. And when they're completely dead, sitting there in the meditation hall, now they're practicing meditation correctly because they are so still and they're so quiet that there's nothing going on.
Right.
This is not what we're practicing here. We're practicing to wake up.
Right.
This is what sati is all about, is to wake up into your senses, to wake up and see what's going on, and most specifically, to wake up and see how critical we are of ourselves,
Hmm.
making basically that same argument inside the mind that the authorities were making. In other words, now we have bought that entire set of archived tapes that we learned from all of our parents, all of our authorities when we were kids, and even the authorities that we have now.
Hmm.
That we That's how we live, is according to the rules,
Right.
and we have to make sure that I'm in line with these rules. There's
Hmm.
a lot of thou shalt nots and a lot of punishments and a lot of this kind of stuff in here, and we need to change those kind of thoughts from unwholesome thoughts of criticism
Hmm.
into wholesome thoughts of nurturing.
Right. Is there a
This
time?
is the main thing about the first jhana, is that we
Hmm.
have to come out of critical thinking. If the student does not, and none of the Western Buddhist practices that I know of teach most specifically, the very first thing is you have to remove the hindrances from the mind, regardless of what your meditation object is. The
Hmm.
meditation object in and of itself is almost irrelevant. In other words, whatever the meditation object is, when I go to the object, that's good. But when I go away from the object, that's bad. And it doesn't matter where I go to, that's a hindrance from being on this object.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So it doesn't matter what so much the object is, but the Buddha gives one in the beginning, and that would be the breath, because there's extra advantages to have the breath as our object of meditation, but we're not going to keep it that way. That in fact, there's a whole lot of objects of meditation that we're going to have. One object of meditation would be the eye and seeing, and the consciousness of seeing.
Mm-hmm.
These are all things. So this actually can be the next talk that we have. But basically, the question that I'm raising now is that once you can get yourself into the first jhana, once you can get the mind completely wholesome,
Mm-hmm.
and that you have gladdened the mind and gotten the mind all into a really good state, and so much that you basically have talked yourself into feeling really good. So now that the student is feeling good, he's got comfort, security, satisfaction, and then eventually success at that. So when those things are built up into the first jhana, now the question
Mm-hmm.
will be, well, what do we do with it?
That's a good question. I'm itching to know.
That's right, because a lot of people say, well, now that I feel really good, so what?
Right. What do we use it for? Yeah.
And then some students will come out of their meditation with the sense of, well, that was nice, but I've had about as much joy as I can stand right now.
Well, thank you so much for talking with me this evening. It's been a real pleasure, and as
Okay.
always, I really appreciate
next
it.
time you call, we will do that. So keep that in mind and ask that question of, once we get the mind in a good state, what do we do with it?
Sure.
How do
I'll
we
keep.
and I'll give you a clue.
Yeah.
And the clue is, you got yourself into the first jhana by maintaining wholesome mind state.
Mm-hmm.
So part of the job is to maintain that wholesome mind state.
Mm-hmm.
Another point would be that once we have gotten rid of the hindrances completely, that means that whatever we're going to be noticing, whatever we're going to be noting, is not going to be the hindrances.
Mm-hmm.
Where mostly the people who are practicing Mahasi, they do the noting and they note the hindrance. They note the hindrance and they see it, and dukkha, dukkha, dukkha. I see that dukkha. I'm going really deep into that dukkha now. We call this deep meditation. And if I go deep enough into that dukkha, I'm going to find some insight in there someplace.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But no, now that we've gotten the mind completely wholesome, there is no unwholesome states that are to be investigated. Only wholesome things are to be investigated, because that's all that's left now.
Right.
And if we would notice something that is unwholesome, we immediately throw it out, not investigate it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we're only going to be investigating wholesome things.
Right.
Is being free from the hindrances a wholesome thing?
Yes.
Then that's to be investigated. How about having the mind to be applied to the wholesome and keep the mind sustained on the wholesome? Is that a wholesome thing?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Then therefore, that's the thing that needs to be mindfully noted. This is applied thought. This is sustained thought. How is my applied thought? Is it working right? Is it working right? Okay. Another one. How about sati? Is sati a wholesome thing? To wake up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Therefore, that's to be noticed or investigated while we're in a really wholesome state of first jhana. How is my sati?
Right.
Another one would be the investigation itself. Investigate my investigation. How is my investigation? That would be
Right.
something. How by effort? How's my energy? So now we're actually spending our time on wholesome things.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we'll go into a great deal of in detail later, but this is the idea: is that once you get into the first jhana, the things that we need to notice then in the first jhana are the first jhana factors. How's my piti? Wow, this feels really nice.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah. Ooh. Oh, this is third noble truth. Oh, I'm completely free from suffering right now. Isn't that marvelous? Okay.
Right.
These are the things that we're going to be doing, is that we're looking for joy and we're finding it, and we're investigating the wholesome. We investigate the jhana factors. We investigate the Eightfold Noble Path. In fact, we investigate the Four Noble Truths. This
Mm-hmm.
is all wholesome stuff.
Right.
Okay. But in that regard, we're only going to be investigating only part of the Eightfold No, only part of the whole process of Paticca Samuppada. We're
Mm-hmm.
not going to investigate the whole thing. Why? Because after feelings, when ignorance comes in that takes us into grasping and clinging and being reborn again into the hell worlds, etc., we're not doing that right now.
Right. Right.
That's for the Mahasi meditator to do. That's why he's going to wind up in a state of fear, misery, disgust, and great desire to get out of it. But we're sitting in the first jhana, so we're not going to have any of that. But what we
Yeah.
can investigate is, what are feelings? How do things contact me? What is perception? What is consciousness? These are the things that would be wholesome.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now that you've got the mind fit for work, now the time for noting when the mind is fit for work. Most of the noting for most meditators is done when the mind's not fit for work.
Right.
Okay,
So the
does that give
wholesome,
you?
yeah, we're leading toward the wholesome, which are things that will help us to ultimately, you know, release the hindrances, release clinging, and yada yada, liberation. Right.
Right, exactly. Cool.
Great. Great.
When there's no more friction, things don't get hot, and when things don't get hot, they're unconditioned with that heat,
You're
and things
cool.
are just cool. Yeah. So the Pali word that the Buddha used, nibbana, we use that in English language when we say cool off,
Mm-hmm.
or
Mm-hmm.
cool, baby, cool. Okay, chill.
Yeah.
These are the words. That's what nibbana means. But yet in Western Buddhism, nibbana is way up there near Jesus someplace, way out of reach.
Right.
Okay, well, James, you got someplace to go with this, and so I'll see you later. Got another call coming in.
Sure. Thank you so much again for your time and your just everything. Have a wonderful week, and we'll talk soon.
May you be happy.
You too. May you be well.
Right bloody now.
Okay. See you.